Up my presentation. Okay, great. Well, thank you everyone so much for joining us today. I'm excited to get to share a little bit about the importance of storytelling and visualization and how they fit into the world of data. As Jorge mentioned, if you have any questions as we go through the presentation, feel free to drop those in the chat, and we'll leave some time at the end of the presentation for question and answers and discussion. As Jorge mentioned, I work on the IE team as the data visualization specialist, where I help create visual stories for key indicators that are related to academic affairs and student success across the UT system. So my journey into data visualization and storytelling has been a little bit unusual and definitely not what I expected when I graduated with a Bachelor of Arts degree in graphic design. I honestly didn't even know that data visualization existed when I first started my career. So how did I end up as a data visualization specialist without a background in data or analytics? Well, my first job out of college was working for a mutual funds turned advisor services company. And here I worked on a lot of projects creating infographics and visualizations for financial statistics and planning information. So that sort of got me involved working with data in the beginning. And then I moved from the financial world into a small tech startup that was focused on behavioral science and AI-based communication. Here we focused a lot on communication styles and learning the significance of a visual narrative and storytelling. We did a lot of work with persona-based communications, which really required us to synthesize a lot of high-level data and then apply it to human behavior. And then my next career step was into the University of Tennessee, working at the Research Foundation. At UTRF, I spent a lot of time creating reports and graphics that were based on data from UT's innovations and patents and disclosure numbers, things like that. I began working with the institutional effectiveness team in early 2020 to really help simplify the UT system's reporting process of student data via data visualization. So in order to effectively tell stories with data, we really need to start with storytelling itself and why that's important. Why storytelling? Storytelling is something that's innately human. It's the foundation of our history and how we interact with the world. Through storytelling, we learn about our own personal experiences and those of others around us. Stories provide us with context and understanding and structure to the activities of our existence. But the thing that's most important about storytelling is it goes beyond the facts. It's able to tap into the emotional elements of the human experience. So good stories answer questions and elicit responses. It has the power to inspire and to connect us and to drive change. So the ability to provide meaning and a persuasive call to action for the audience is one of the most valuable assets that storytelling brings into the world of data. We live in a really information-saturated and data-on-demand society, from news and media reports to website analytics and social media engagement. The average person is pretty inundated with data on their day-to-day basis. But for those who don't really consistently work with figures or speak the language of numbers, it's really easy to get lost in the complex data and for it to become noise. So that's where the value of data storytelling comes into play. Data storytelling helps humanize the data. It simplifies and contextualizes really complicated information to make it more approachable. Applying storytelling methods to data engages the audience and allows you to elaborate on the significance of data or answer questions that the data may raise. This Lego example that's on the right of the screen shows how data storytelling really helps you guide the audience through the process of distilling different pieces of data into a tangible picture. In addition, well-executed data storytelling can lend credibility to an organization by showcasing their process of analysis, and it can also promote brand awareness and establish thought leadership in that same way. The push in higher education to emphasize data-driven decision-making, combined with the extensive amount of data that's available in these institutions, is one of the most compelling reasons to focus on data storytelling. At a university level, the presidents and chancellors care about things like enrollment numbers, engagement, retention of students and faculty, research expenditures, graduation rates, to name a few. They use the data around all of these different indicators to make key decisions that affect your campus initiatives and funding and university branding as a whole. So how are data stories different from simply displaying data in spreadsheets or on isolated dashboards? The answer is that these stories help to answer the question of why something is happening and not just what is happening. As kind of EDUCAUSE review outlines in their 2023 report from February, addressing the why differentiates the data stories from the hard data. In terms of higher education, it's also important to keep in mind that most of the numbers that we're reporting represent students. So it's not just about figures and campus performance. All of these different numbers illustrate the experiences and the decisions of real people with lots of diverse lives and experiences. So how do you go about crafting an effective data story? Laying the groundwork for the story begins with setting a clear goal. This goal can be defined by the interest of your audience, by the request of a client or a partner, by a business objective that you have. All of those things might help you determine what your goal is. But all of the parties involved in the story should agree on what the goal is and work together to develop an implementation process for the goal. The planning phase should outline the essential pieces of the project and assign roles and responsibilities to the different partners. Following your project planning, data storytelling typically begins by determining the narrative and conducting data analysis to establish the questions the story will answer or the insights that it will present. The best data stories provide narratives that contextualize data in the visualizations and don't just regurgitate what the reader can see. Clear direction from the data narrative then informs the whole visualization process. So really integrating narrative, data, and visual components presents insights in a way that simultaneously appeals to human emotion, logic, and aesthetic. Narrative and visuals engage the audience emotionally, and data visualization reveals patterns or trends, while the data narrative provides the explanations or answers to the why questions. So in this way, construction of a successful data story includes just 3 basic foundational elements of narrative, data, and visuals, and they all work together to influence decisions and drive change in the outcome. Data visualization is a key part of bringing the storytelling process to life. So let's dive a little bit into some of the key components of the visualization process. As one of the foundational elements of a good data story, data visualization plays a significant role in the effectiveness of that story. It reveals the data. It's a tool that utilizes the strength of visual communication to go beyond sort of the spoken or written language and simplify the cognitive computational processes that are happening. Data visualization can help identify trends. It can highlight important data variations or abnormalities. It can provide context to the narrative. It can uncover areas for improvement, and it can help organize really complex data. I really like this quote from Frederick Molsteller and think it speaks to the value of data visualization. If data's voices can be soft and sly, then it's all about bringing understanding and clarity to the data in a way that is really easily digestible for the audience. The most successful data stories serve the audience, which means that their needs should really weigh heavily into what's driving the visualization. Data visualization should support the story and provide value to the audience. Some questions to consider when we're thinking about the audience might be, what are their different interests or pain points? How does your data affect them? How does the audience best receive information? Things like what would they find beneficial? What is their level of familiarity with their data? All of those are great questions to sort of get you thinking about your audience and what their needs might be. It may help to consider the variety of audiences that's consuming your data and their independent levels of interest that they might be bringing to your project. But you do want to keep in mind that the narrative can't be all things to all people. So it's really important to prioritize a primary target audience and focus on what you think that their needs will be. Begin with the end in mind is a really popular saying, and I think it applies directly to the data visualization process. After creating visuals and composing the data story, how will you deliver them to your audience? It's really important to consider this question before you begin the visualization process, because the format of the final product will impact the process of the data display. A few common presentation methods for data include dashboards, infographics, report, and slide presentations. The output method that you choose should tie into the purpose of your data story and the overall needs of your audience. Dashboards allow users to explore and monitor data sets that may change over time. Infographics help inform, entertain, or persuade the audience, usually on a singular topic. Reports often include many different data analyses and sets of stories that tie into a larger narrative. And then slide presentations can vary widely in their use of data visualization, but typically they support an oral narrative or emphasize certain insights that the speaker would like to share with an audience. So what are components of good data visualization? How do you go about creating visuals with data? Data visualization is really an intersection of good design, accurate data, and functionality. All three of these elements are pretty essential for an effective visualization. Data and function without design produces a pretty complex visual that's all substance and no style. Graphics that combine data and design while excluding function lack purpose and precision. And design and function that ignore data result in an inaccurate visual that can be misleading to the audience. Good data visualization is a balance between having the right information and making sure that that information is presented in a way that's not only accurate, but appealing and efficiently understood. Considering things like transparency, readability, and simplicity also greatly aid in effective data visualization. Data and statistics function as the foundation for the visualization and its credibility, which means transparency is pretty critical. You need to tell the truth about the data and strive to show data variation over design variation. Ensuring sources are reliable and results are reproducible is really important because the audience must trust the data, which means that the visuals should not show data disproportionately or out of context. Equally, data visualization can't provide function without readability. If a visualization fails to consider readability, it's essentially abstract art. A readable visual has really clear labels, a proper use of scale, accurate proportions, and a consistent visual style. It engages the audience with clarity and accessibility. The audience shouldn't have difficulty distinguishing the different analyses and data sets in your story. And then finally, simple design is a hallmark of good data visualization. An effective visual should draw little to no attention to the design itself, but rather entice the viewer into the interesting content. You want to focus on the clear execution of the data over a gimmicky visual container. An important question to ask is, would removing this element in the design change anything? Clutter and embellishment and ornament do not equal visual sophistication, so you want to keep things simple. A few notes on the design aspects of visualization, and Edward Tufte has a really great quote that I think is pretty encompassing about what he calls graphical elegance. He says that graphical elegance is often found in simplicity of design and complexity of data. Attractive displays of statistical information have a properly chosen format and design. Use words, numbers, and drawing together. Reflect a balanced proportion and sense of relevant scale. Display an accessible complexity of detail. Have a narrative quality, a story to tell about the data. They're done in a professional manner with technical details of production done with care. You want to avoid content-free decoration and avoid what he calls chart junk. So to sum it up, the components of an effective visualization are good design, keeping in mind things like spacing, proportion, and size, typography, your use of color, the chart type and frequency, and then grid and line weight, data labels, and titles. So speaking of chart type, determining the appropriate chart type for a visualization of data is essential in the design process. Though finding a starting point might seem daunting because there are a lot of options out there when it comes to different chart types, most data software like Excel offers suggestions on the type of chart type that's going to fit with your relevant data set. If you're looking for inspiration or just want to gain a better understanding of different visualization types that are out there, datavizproject.com is an incredible resource. And so that's what you see in the slide here is the homepage of that website. This website showcases over 100 unique visualization types. It's got almost any chart type that you could think of and then some. So these are just some examples on that homepage. But once you click into a particular visualization type, you'll find complete descriptions of what the visualization type is, the chart type family that's a part of, the different functions and use cases that apply to the visualization type. And then there are also actual examples of other work in that area. So if you're looking, for different types of charts and you're curious about what might work well for your data, this is a great place to start. Or if you just want to get ideas about the different types of things that are out there, datavizproject.com is a great resource. So let's talk a little bit about the relationship between chart type and function. Among the most common visualization types are things like bar graphs, line graphs, pie charts, scatter plots, area charts. I'm sure most of you are familiar with those types of visualizations. On your screen now is an example from Adobe that sort of sorts through the high-level visualization types into categories. And these categories that they use are comparisons, trends, parts to whole, relationships, and distributions. So things like bar graphs, tables, and conditional formatting work really well for comparisons within your data. Part to whole evaluations typically use things like line charts, bar charts, area charts. All of those are great for trends over time, Part to whole evaluations are good with different things like bar charts, donut or pie charts, and stacked area charts. When you're thinking about relationships that fall between different data segments, things like scatter plots, Venn diagrams, bubble charts, all of those different types of visualizations work really well for those types of data sets. And then finally, if you're looking at different data distributions, things like histograms work really well for those. And then again, this just represents a high-level approach to choosing a right data visualization for your story, but there's lots of other options. Available tools also play a really important role in how effective data visualization comes together. Findings from the Data Visualization Society State of the Industry 2022 report indicate a wide variety of tools used by over 1,500 different respondents who identify as data visualizers in some capacity. You'll see the results from that study on your screen and then a list of all the different visualization types that users reported having used. Tools with the largest number of users include things like Excel, Tableau, PowerPoint, Power BI, R, Google Sheets, Adobe Illustrator, Pen and Paper, ggplot2, and Python. Of these, Pen and Paper, Tableau, R, ggplot2, and Illustrator had the highest number of users who indicated that they liked the tool very much. So in my work with a design background, I use a combination of Pen and Paper, Excel, and Illustrator to create custom visualizations for the reports that I do. Then colleagues on the business intelligence team use Power BI to develop and manage all of the visualizations in the Institutional Effectiveness Dashboard Suite, like we learned about yesterday. So thankfully, there's really a wide range of tools available to give creators options for something that fits their specific needs and skill sets. Most of the tools provide numerous training resources, and the tools that require subscriptions or paid plans usually offer a free trial period for users to test out the functionality before they purchase. Okay, so I've talked a lot about sort of the theories and purpose of data visualization, but what does that look like in practice? Here, I'll just go through a few different examples of the kinds of work that I've created in different roles dealing with data. So in the top left, the UT System Division of Academic Affairs, Research, and Student Success creates an annual report of activities for the year. And that's something that I helped design. And so, putting together reports, there's narrative involved in those that talks about all of our different projects, but then there's also accompanying data visualizations that go with that. In the 2 pages in the bottom right of the screen show data that are around tech transfer, and that's from an annual report that I did when I worked for the Research Foundation. So just another example of how data visualization might appear inside a larger annual report. Infographics are also a really large part of my work. The document in the bottom left of the screen shows an employee demographic that we did for a board meeting. And then the top picture in the third column is an infographic that is all about student debt in Tennessee. I've also worked on some things like fact sheets. So that would be something that's in the top right. And that includes sort of more narrative and visuals working together. And then slide presentations are also a big part of my work too. And so you'll see examples of those in the second column. A large part of my work also includes preparing reports for the UT Board of Trustees meeting. And so when I first began working with the IE team, starting in early 2020, our first focus was on the way that we report the system's student data to the board. So previously, the data presentation looked like the line charts that you're seeing on the screen now. And that was how all of the data about student success was presented in that same way as line graphs on different PowerPoint slides. So one of our challenges with that presentation was that it became kind of repetitive because the same visualization type was used for all of the different categories of data. So we wanted something that would sort of set the different data sets apart and just bring a little bit more visual variety into these reports that we were giving to the board. So for this particular first project that we work on, we focused on how to best simplify the 2018 enrollment data compared to peers. And this is a just high-level overview of how the project developed. From that PowerPoint slide that we saw a minute ago on the previous screen, it evolved into the report that's on the left, which provided us with more visual variety, but still included a little bit too much text and is a little bit cluttered. So we focused on removing the elements that weren't necessary to the presentation, and then the report became the final document that's on the right. You'll notice in this document, everything is laid out in really clearly labeled sections that are pretty easy to follow. There's a consistency in the text size and also in the use of color. And then all of the design elements are there to add meaning or support the narrative of the data. Since that time of our first project, the board materials have evolved into multi-page reports that give a really in-depth look at our campuses. And these reports represent the largest projects that I work on, and they typically follow the same process. And so the way that that process works is that we'll begin with a content outline and then do a visualization brainstorm, move into a proof of concept, followed by revisions, and then final publication. And then from the final publication, we create a presentation and all of the materials that are associated with that. In the content outline, our goal is to define what we refer to as the so whats. And so we ask questions like, what is it that the audience cares about? What does the data say? And what do we want to communicate? In this step, the team really works to answer some of those questions. And it all starts with the data. We look at the data that's available to us and define the messaging and the size of the piece. And then we also work to create a list of all of the different metrics that need to be included. And so that's kind of what you'll see on the screen here is just an outline of all the different pieces that we want to include in the report and all of the different metrics and for which particular campuses. All of that is put into the outline, and then that helps us determine the scope of the work and everything that will need to be completed so that we can get a good understanding of the timeline and then all of the different project participants. From there, we move into looking at the kinds of data that we've chosen for the report and brainstorming some different ideas for potential visualization types that could fit the different data sets. This step usually happens by hand, and it's a very rough draft of all the different pieces that are going to go into the puzzle. It's important to note that the ideas that are developed during this stage might change as we work through the process, especially once the actual data is included. But this does provide a really great starting place for our proof of concept, which is the next step. So after brainstorming all of those initial puzzle pieces, they start to come together in what I call a proof of concept. And so here's where we really work on determining the different visual elements and the types of charts and graphics that are going to make sense for each data subject, sort of placing them together in context, thinking about other things that we might want to add to the report, like pictures or other graphics that make sense. And a lot of that goes into helping just again, humanize the data and helping us remember that all of these numbers and metrics, they are related to our students. And so they're representative of that. We want to keep that as a main focus. But considering variety in this step is really important. So when the decisions about all the different visual elements are made, then we can create a layout and this physical proof of concept, which doesn't include actual data at this point. We're just getting an idea of, how long is the report going to be and what are all the different pieces that are going to be included? Have we included all of the right pieces? And then we just lay out all of the basic shapes and create the general style. But it's also, again, just really important to make sure everything is flowing together visually and that it's going to support the narrative cohesively. So from the proof of concept, then we begin on actually populating the draft. We collect all the actual data and work on building out visualizations, adding labels and notes where they should go, and then selecting the appropriate colors and things to that effect. There are a few different ways to go about building graphs and charts and visualizations. Because we work with such large data sets, I build most of our base graphics for the reports in Excel. Our team, collects all of and organizes all of the data using Excel. So it's really easy for me to take those spreadsheets that our data analysts have developed and make the graphics from those. And building the graphs in Excel also really ensures just accurate proportions and scale across all of our different data sets. It's important to note that reports can be built and edited directly in Excel. Excel has a great capability to edit chart colors and do things like line weights and change the fonts. So it's very possible to create good-looking visualizations natively in Excel. However, due to the amount of data that we report and the need to customize the layout and the data arrangement, I create the bulk of the reports that I do in a design program called Illustrator. So once we've looked through all of the data and selected the best visuals, I'll copy and paste the graphs from Excel into Illustrator. This method does have a few limitations, but it keeps the size and the scale of the data accurate, which is really important. So once all of those shapes for the base graphics are in Illustrator, they're really easy to recolor and reformat to match all of the specific branding that we want to make sure we adhere to, that the communications and marketing team has laid out for us. And so we want to make sure that we're partnering with them to make sure that there's visual cohesion so that the final product looks like something that has come from the UT system. Also in Illustrator, it's really easy to just move around the different pieces of the layout, which is important when working with different data sets and trying to fit a lot of data into one page. As I kind of mentioned earlier, it's really important to work with both consistency and variety. If you've looked at our reports, you'll notice that we try to use the same visualization types across similar categories. So for example, all of our enrollment data is presented the exact same way for each of the campuses. But on each page, we try to have variety to where no two visuals look alike. And this really allows the audience to easily separate the different data sets and to be able to tell when the topic of the data that they're looking at has changed. And then, so when I'm working on smaller, like 1 to 4 page projects, everything sort of stays natively in Illustrator, and that's the design tool that I use. But for some of these larger projects where there's a lot of images and other design elements, I work with another tool called InDesign. And so after building out all of the graphics in Illustrator, I will link everything to the InDesign program that just handles things like images and design elements, can do things like table of contents and all of that sort of stuff a lot easier than the design tool. And so all of the additional elements are brought together in this final step to create the finalized report. So here is an example of a finished product, and this is a report that we gave to the Board of Trustees in June of last year. This report represents the different peer comparisons across all of our different campuses. So one of the challenges that we face in presenting data as a system with diverse campuses is that all the campuses have different needs. So how do we make meaningful comparisons for each campus? We used to show all of the campuses' data together, but found that this led to sort of an unhelpful comparison between campuses. So now we separate the data for each campus out so that we can focus on the individual campuses and their data stories against just specifically their peers. So from that finalized report that gets sent to the board, the final set is building out presentation materials. So the board will have those reports that they can look at, but we also want to think about that there's going to be a presenter that is presenting on this material. And so the building out the presentation layer is where everything kind of comes together and ties the data into a story. And so the visuals, hopefully they will show the data in a way that's really engaging and interesting to the audience. But the presenter then adds the context and provides the narrative of the data. And so that might look like explaining why the data is trending up or down, or putting the data in context to what's happening across the state or across the nation. But ultimately, it's all of these pieces, the visuals, the data, and the narrative, working together to tell the story of student success across all of our different campuses. So if you're looking for some data storytelling or visualization resources and inspiration, here are a list of things that I love or find really helpful. The first thing is author Edward Tufte has a lot of great content on talking about visualization of data with data sets, both small and large. And he has written a few different books, Visual Display of Quantitative Information, Visual Explanations. Those are really helpful if you just want to learn more about the theory of data visualization and what it looks like to incorporate visualization into your larger data story. We looked at DataViz Project earlier. I love that website and go there for ideas and inspiration all the time. A couple of other websites that just have curated work from lots of different creators are Beautiful News Daily and Cool Infographics. So another great place to get inspiration and just see what other people are doing in terms of data visualization and how they're thinking about bringing kind of design and narrative and data all together. Microsoft has a really great blog called What is Data Storytelling that's very informative. Some of the things that I talked about today came from there, but there's also other things that I didn't mention. So if you want to know more about that, that's a great resource. If you want to know, thinking about, specifically higher education, what does data visualization look like and what are some more applications for that specific to higher ed? There's an EDUCAUSE review from February 2nd, 2023, and that's really insightful and helpful. And then finally, there's a data visualization and analysis workspace presentation that has a lot of different thoughts that are geared towards the importance of data storytelling in general. So all of those are really great resources. And then, as always, I would be happy to answer any questions that you have outside of today. My contact information is there. I love doing data visualization and data storytelling, so I'm always happy to talk about it. But with that, we'd love to hear any questions that you might have about data visualization and storytelling. And so I'll now open the floor for questions and discussion.
Thanks, Katie. We have just one question right now in the chat. So I'll say for anyone who is thinking about something, feel free to drop it in the chat. I'm happy to share it with Katie for you. The first question I have for you is about how you deal with data pre-processing and data preparation. And so as you're getting ready to put something together, how do you address misspelled or information or typos in the data that could then affect the accuracy or insights derived during the process? And so specifically, do we perform data pre-processing manually or automatically? And the example that this person gave is that in the salary dashboard, sometimes there are duplications of titles like data analyst 1 or where it's the numeral versus the letter I for the Roman numeral. So can you speak a little bit to how we do the preparation work to create these visuals and make sure we've got clean data?
Yeah, that's great. And so for our team, the data analysts actually handle most of that. They're really great about preparing all of the data for us and checking it against the different data sources to make sure that it's accurate. So if there's anybody on the team that wants to maybe speak a little bit more to that, I would be happy for somebody else to jump in. But for my part, it's really, if I have questions about the data, working with them to make sure that things are accurate and really just see, sort of us sorting through that process at the beginning, like asking the questions, okay, does this make sense? If there are things that look like they're duplicate, going back to the original source and checking that. But if there's anybody on the IR team that would like to speak maybe to the data cleaning process, I would love for you all to maybe talk a little bit about that.
I can jump in, and I'm Brian Hester. I'm Director of Institutional Research and Business Intelligence in the IE team. And I think it also, not just with the IR group, but with the business intelligence team as well, there's data cleaning that goes into this from the very, from the back end, the steps involved in aligning the data, standardizing it across the campuses, but looking for just unit record issues, such as your example, that starts with business intelligence group, I think, and then the IR team then aggregate that data and look further for any types of inconsistencies, and do as best as we can to, when we hand it off to Katie, that she doesn't have to find these types of issues. She probably still does every now and then, and she tactfully points them out, and we go back and we do our best to clean them up. But that's just in general how it goes before it gets to Katie.
Thanks,
but anybody else, if they want to jump in, they can add anything too.
I have a question on how do you meld the student data with the financial data? Is that pretty much done within the two databases? How is that being done? Sorry if that wasn't clear. I'm trying to meld the financial data that I get out of the business warehouse and melding that with the student data, so that you can maybe tie some financial information maybe down to a student's majors, for example.
Well, I can jump in, and anyone else again can as well. But John, I think that a lot of that goes into the specific report or project that we're involved with, but depending on the outcome that we're looking for, that melding again can take place far upstream, where we're pulling data from, say, our unit record student data we've collected from the campuses and what's called our student information system, and then as well using the business warehouse, which I think you're familiar with, and doing our best to align that where it's at the appropriate student level or at the appropriate campus or institute. So there's modeling that goes into that. There's modeling that takes place, and then again there's further analysis that does the appropriate ratios and aligning that information at that institutional research step, and then taking it on like a case-by-case basis.
Thanks, Brian. One other question from the chat is, how do you determine the visualizations to use in the Power BI dashboards, as these seem to fall in the category of being everything to everyone? So can you speak a little bit to how we've tailored that to any of the dashboards to what is actually a very broad audience, I would say, right? We're thinking of a lot of different constituencies with those public sites.
Right, yes. So when we're thinking in terms of dashboards, you're thinking about information that people are probably going to be coming back to time after time, right? So it's mostly trend focused data. And so that's the place where you really start, is if you're having different trends of data, that's going to look different than if you're just focused on data at a single moment in time. So thinking about visualization types that work really well for trends. So as we talked a little bit about earlier, things like line charts and bar graphs and things that are really good at showing change in data over time. That's the sort of the best place to start when you're thinking about data dashboards and thinking about data that's going to be really dynamic and changing. So when you come back to it at a different point in time, it may be different. And in terms of the actual development of the dashboard too, you also have to work within the limits of what Power BI can do. And Jimmy Wittenbarger did a lot of the lead development on our dashboards in terms of Power BI. So Jimmy, if you want to speak a little bit to that in terms of what it's like to work with Power BI and the different maybe constraints of using visualizations, I'm sure that would be really helpful as well.
Yeah, sure. So really, honestly, I just try to keep it simple, keep it as basic as possible, because really they're just trying to get an answer from the visual, and you put a lot of complicated visuals on a page. A lot of times that's just noise and it doesn't really achieve what you're trying to do. But yeah, your answer is spot on. You know, it just really depends on what kind of question you're trying to answer with the visual, whether it's trend or whatever.
On a related note, maybe one or both of you could speak a little bit to your advice for what training sources folks might speak or might use to become proficient at Power BI. So I think, Katie, you've offered a lot of data visualization things in, broadly. What kinds of things could our audience look to also incorporate that into a Power BI setting?
I can handle that one. Really, YouTube is fantastic. I learned myself from a couple Udemy courses that I purchased, but really there's tons and tons and tons of just free resources out there. But I would definitely start with YouTube and just search for Power BI basics and pick one of like the most popular videos that way.
Thanks, Jimmy. And everyone, if you can unmute and ask questions as well if you don't want to drop things in the chat. Anything else for Katie and her beautiful artwork and data visualization?
I have a quick question, actually, and it's kind of a broader question for Katie. I'm curious, and I'm not sure if I'm formulating this the best way, so feel free to elaborate. There's a kind of tension that I can begin to see between the kind of layout that Power BI and dashboards offer and some of what you're saying about narrative. Often with narrative, you're trying to convey some sequentiality and causality that you're imposing that you want the reader or viewer to receive. But with a dashboard or other interactive element, you're often trying to let people navigate based on where they want to go. It's more like a map or a, something that's user driven. And I was wondering how you navigate the sort of tension between those things, especially if you're in a format where things are asynchronous or where there's not an opportunity for a presenter to step in and say, well, here's how I would, respond to something. So I'm curious about that tension over who's in control.
Yeah, that is a fantastic question. And I think, goes back to a lot when you're thinking in the beginning of a project, sort of what is the purpose of this project, right? So in giving a presentation or a report where the narrative is pretty defined, like you get to control that narrative a lot more versus what you're saying in a dashboard. It's very much the user has a lot more sort of control in what they're taking out of the narrative, right? And so actually, when we worked on developing our dashboards that were presented yesterday in the session, one of the things that we really thought about was, so for dashboards particularly, what's the user experience and how does the user navigate through the dashboards? And so letting that sort of be how your narrative is controlled. So for us in that instance, we have, when you first come to the dashboards, there's sets of landing pages for each category. And we really worked with looking at the data and thinking about, okay, what do we feel on these landing pages are things that are, things that we really want to show, that we want the users to be able to look at and navigate through. And so the things that we chose to include on those landing pages, that's sort of the part of us telling the story of what we think is important. But then we have also all of the different slicers at the bottom of those dashboards that let the users sort of look through the data and see anything that they could possibly want to know. So dashboards in that context, it's a little bit more both and. So it's in the things that you choose to sort of put at the forefront of your dashboards. Those are the things that you are sort of inviting the user to look at first. And so that's communicating from the dashboard standpoint, like, we think that these things are important. Now, that doesn't mean that everything else isn't important too, but that's just a way that you can sort of direct the narrative when you're not able to be physically there and give that, vocal narrative to it. You think about more user experience. So how is the user going to work through this dashboard versus what am I going to say to the user about this data when it's a report or a presentation or something like that? I hope that answers your question. But
That almost sounds like game design.
yeah, and it's very like user experience and design is a big thing, regardless of what the content of the design is. So it's very similar.
Awesome, thanks.
Yeah. Are there any other questions? Or I would even be interested in hearing from people in the audience, what challenges you faced with data visualization, or are there different tools that you all use to do data visualization on your campuses that you found helpful that might be outside of things that we've talked about?
I just wanted to mention when we were looking at the, oh, my bad. But when we were looking at the chart, essentially that was showing the different data visualization tools, it had a QGIS listed over ArcGIS, a paid service. And one of the things I wanted to mention, if you're not, working for UT, if you're doing something independent, there are free tools like Looker Studio, which is made by Google, which essentially can do the same thing as Power BI. It's not as detailed, but it gets the job done.
That's great. Thanks, Michael.
Katie, I had one other question from the chat. What are some good tools that are to create an infographic, but maybe besides the ones you've already shared? This person is wondering if there's anything UT specific. What kinds of resources can you think of that might especially help with like branding or building things specifically for our system?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are a lot of design aid tools out there that are free subscriptions. I think one of the most popular is Canva. And so Canva has a lot of pre-built templates for infographics where you can sort of take the different pieces and create something that's going to suit your needs. It's great for things if you're not a designer or don't particularly enjoy doing design. There's lots of different options in that. But when you're thinking about creating something for your particular campus or office as a whole, most of the colleges have offices of marketing and communication that will have some sort of brand guidelines in terms of recommended colors for you to use, recommended fonts for you to use, and then, just a little bit of language and some rules around all of those things. So for us, when I'm creating pieces for the UT system brand, there's a website that's called brand.tennessee.edu, and there's all different types of resources about the different colors to use, like how to use those colors in combination, different fonts to use, and, what is good in terms of accessibility standards. So most of your departments or campuses have things like that are available to you through your Office of Communications and Marketing. So, I think starting there is a great place if you're trying to create something on brand to look through those things. And there's a lot of resources there as well.
Thanks, Katie.
I'd actually like to add something that might be a continuation to Chris's previous question about controlling the kinds of visuals depending upon the narrative. One of the things that I've said, if you think back to what Katie said about the progression of our reports from based on Excel, Excel graphics to custom visuals that she created that were static, now we're moving into the dynamic world with the dashboards. And one of the things that we've talked about as a team is that one of our greatest challenges is going to be how we close the gap between the custom visuals that Katie creates for our static reports and the dynamic visuals that we're able to create with Power BI. And so even though Power BI has advanced quite a lot over the years, it's still not as sophisticated as what Katie can do, obviously, in those custom visuals. And so that does present quite a challenge for us. And I think we've done a good job. I think the dashboards look amazing. But again, how we move forward and close that gap, remembering that if our audience, our primary audience, one of our primary stakeholders is the Board of Trustees. So if they get a certain kind of report printed out to them, a static report in hard copy, we want to see, we want to keep those dynamic visuals as similar to that as possible. So big challenge, but I think we're doing a good job of this so far.
Are there any other outstanding questions or just thoughts that you all have in your experience with data visualization?
I guess I just have a quick question. I'm sorry, just following up on what was just mentioned. So I guess one way, do we look at kind of closing that gap? Do you have kind of a cutoff date? And you say that after the census day of whenever you report the data, that's whenever you're gonna do your static and kind of dashboards, and then have another set time of whenever you're gonna maybe update it again? Or how are you kind of closing that gap a little bit? I know you said that's a question you're trying to do, but what are your kind of current thought processes?
Jorge, would you like to speak to that a little bit?
I'm not sure that the dates really collide in that way for us. What we've done traditionally is we know there is a rhythm to our reporting to the board, for example. So we know what we're going to report to the board in the 3 board meetings. And so we back up about 2 months from that, and whatever data we have available is what we can use for that upcoming board meeting. I don't really think it's the collision isn't so much of when the data is available. It's more that, we present it one way in our static visuals, and now we're trying to make sure that in the dynamic visuals, it's as close to that as possible, but it also has to fit the capabilities of Power BI. Does that make sense, Julie? I'm not sure if I answered your question. Maybe you can dig a little deeper and help me understand better.
That helps. That helps. I was just thinking for, we do annual reports, and when do we pull the data and things like that. So what you mentioned helps. Thank you very much.
Okay, sure.
Okay, I have another question in the chat. Do you find there are any types or kinds of data that are especially difficult to visualize or form a narrative with? And what is your approach when you come up against those situations?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, for us, the challenge is that we have so much data available, right? So it's what do we want to focus on? There's so much data that's available to us. There's so much that the board or other UT constituents are interested in. I think the hardest part in that is actually creating the narrative and finding the things that we want to talk about and communicate. So in terms of like what types or kinds of data are hard to visualize, I would say really large data sets are hard to visualize. And so with data visualization, we're thinking about, making things simple. We want to make it easy for the audience to understand. So when there are lots of different factors in your data and lots of different components into them, I think my biggest challenge is seeing how much can we show simply. So there you are going to reach a limit where you just have too many elements. I think, if somebody is looking at a data visualization and it takes them more than 10 minutes to understand what's going on, then there's probably too much there, right? So that's the challenge, is finding that sweet spot of making sure that we communicate as much as we can with the data that we're showing, but then also making sure that it's easy to digest and understand on the part of the person that is looking at it. And so I think that's probably my hardest challenge, is thinking about all of the different data that we want to show and all the different ways that we could show it, but butting that up against what actually makes sense and is feasible with the times and the constraints that we have in terms of having somebody be able to process that data pretty quickly and pretty easily. Because the reality of the situation is, and going to thinking about your audience, people don't want to spend 10 or 15 minutes looking at a visualization trying to figure out what's going on. So the purpose of visualizing the data for the audience is so they can look at it, 1 to 2 minutes, have a good understanding of what's happening, and then move on.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great answer. And it honestly, it reminds me too of something that just came up in one of our meetings this week, talking about potential future dashboards, that there's some questions that we've gotten that are really a big set of data that does not lend itself well to something pretty, something that has lots of interesting graphics to it. And so ultimately, right, we decided in this case, really a table is going to be the best way to do this, right? And so sometimes flashy, quick, pretty nice looking things are actually not the best. And so I think too, there's something to knowing like, no, this doesn't need to be transformed. The best way for someone to look at this is actually in something that's a little bit bigger, in something that they might have to do some scrolling, but it's because of the particular kind of data and how people would use it, right? And so knowing when to say, no, actually, we can leave this alone to some extent, right? Can also be, I think, really important.
Yeah. And that's great, Ashley. And I think, again, just going back to who is your audience and what are their wants and needs. If you have an audience that is very detail oriented and they want all of the information possible about your data, things like tables and a place where you can include just kind of the nitty gritty of the data, like that is super important. But then you have other audiences that are just interested in sort of getting a general sense of what's going on, and they just kind of want the high points and the high parts. And that is, I think, really where you see the value of data visualization come in most for that audience that doesn't have the time or desire to spend, to sit down and look at a report for 3 or 4 hours and try to digest what's going on. So yeah, data visualization is probably at its highest and best use when it's giving an easily understandable and quick overview of the different things that you want to communicate. And as we talked about in terms of the data story, fits really well with being able to show something that either a report can elaborate on or a presenter can elaborate on with specific details and sort of that why narrative.
Another question in the chat here from Lee Cheek. How do you consider accessibility, like color blindness, when you're designing visuals and presentations?
Yeah, that's really great. There are a lot of great resources in terms of accessibility for when you're thinking about web design or print design. And our system office is pretty good about helping us look at those things and check for those things. Now, in the things that we're preparing for the board, we're usually using the set of sort of restraints in terms of what is available from our campuses. So for all of the campuses, we use their designated campus colors. And to the best of my knowledge, those are things that have gone through that accessibility check. And when they put out their brand standards, those are things that they've considered. But, in terms of, we try to use so in our peer reports, we'll use different shades of gray. And so that's pretty good for people with color blindness that don't really see color. That's fairly easy for them to differentiate between. But then we always put keys and legends that tell what the different segments are. And we try to label all of our data pretty clearly too, and think about, font size and those types of things that are considered in accessibility standards as well.
Katie? Other questions out there? Other ideas you want to share with Katie? Things you'd like to pick her brain about?
Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. I really enjoyed talking a little bit about data visualization and the different things that I do. I will turn it over to Brian for our wrap up for the day.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you all for joining us today and participating in this great discussion about storytelling with data. I want to especially thank today's presenter, Katie Jones, for sharing her wisdom and creativity with us. I, for one, enjoyed learning more about the various elements that go into effective data visualization and how a good data story both engages the audience and adds clarity and credibility to the information being presented. I hope some of you will be joining us for our final session tomorrow. The IE team's assessment coordinator, Ashley Ludwig, will be leading a panel discussion about utilizing qualitative data with representatives from institutional effectiveness, student life, and assessment from across the system. If you would like to register for this session, you can do so on the Data Analytics Summit website. I think Ashley's dropped a link to that in the chat for you. If we weren't able to get to your question today, or if you want to get in touch with any of this week's presenters, the link to our website where you can find everyone's contact information is in the chat for you as well. And finally, sometimes in the next week, you'll be invited to share your feedback on the summit. So please keep an eye out for a follow-up survey and an email from our team. The survey will also be your opportunity to let us know if you'd like to be included in any other networking opportunities. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.